Now eukaryotic versus prokaryotic DNA, probably our 6th class CBSE question this is. Anyway, you know that prokaryotic is circular and human DNA cannot afford to be circular. If it is not circular only, we have so many atrocious thinking in our mind. Probably if it would have been circular, we would have been more dangerous species, right? Now the next thing is, the amount of the DNA is so much in eukaryotes that it cannot accommodate into a simple nucleus. Just like a big file you want to send by Yahoo Mail, you have to zip the file and send it. So nucleosomes, what is the purpose of them? They basically zip the big file called DNA and pack it inside the DNA. So that requirement is there not in the prokaryotic, rather for the eukaryotic genome, because it has to go and fit inside something called nucleus. So nucleosomes is a feature of eukaryotic, not prokaryotic, so it is not a common feature. Then being located in the nucleus is a feature of eukaryotic, not prokaryotic. Now coming to this supercoiling, supercoiling is a feature which is seen both in the case of prokaryotic and eukaryotic. And you will have both negative supercoils and positive supercoils depending on the environmental condition in both eukaryotic and prokaryotic. So that is the common feature between the two, is what I like to underscore to all of you. I leave remaining things in the literature for you to quickly review. We were discussing about a toroid structure of supercoiling versus plectonymic type of structure. So it is the plectonymic supercoils predominant in prokaryotes, whereas you have both the toroidal and plectonymic forms in the DNA supercoiling in eukaryotes, but supercoiling is definitely a feature of both prokaryotes and eukaryotes, is what I like to finally underscore to all of you. Now what is that laboratory technique by which the supercoils in the DNA are relaxed? It is basically called the microarray technology, wherein the supercoiling of the DNA can be modified, and the modification is required before you analyze the DNA. For that we will be using what is that called as a microarray technology, is what need to be remembered. Maybe to talk about microarray technologies beyond the scope of this present class. Now let us go to the next question. AFP, it is very non-specific marker. It is increased in open neural tube defects, omphalocele, decreased in Down syndrome, and testicular, ovarian, malignant teratoma. Any of these malignancies can lead to the rise of it. It is also increased in hepatoblastoma, chronic viral hepatitis, and cirrhosis also it is elevated. They are all the true statements. Then what are the common tumors in childhood? Very much a general question. You don't need to read all pages of that chapter also. These are all the, next time you go through only headings, that is more than enough, right? So we need to know that leukemia, CNS tumor, lymphoma, neuroblastoma, renal tumor, bone tumor, all these are very much seen. In the case of the childhood tumors, osteogenic sarcoma is also seen, is what need to be remembered. But above 10 years of age group, you see osteosarcoma, Ewing sarcoma, and Hodgkin's, and from the birth up to 4 years of age, you see mainly 3 tumors: retinoblastoma, neuroblastoma, and Wilms tumor, is what need to be remembered. For the embryonal rhabdomyosarcoma, the most common location will be the face and the neck. They are the two classical locations where you come across the embryonal rhabdomyosarcoma. You also find it on extremities, on the trunk, in the retroperitoneal area, in the GI tract, perianal area, anal region, orbital location, parameningeal location, so many other locations also. Now let us talk about rhabdomyolysis. There is no fever, but is there any fever in rhabdomyolysis as a clinical feature? But malignant hyperthermia or any such situation, there can be a breakdown of the muscle. But as a clinical entity, if you take rhabdomyolysis, fever, is it a component? No. But rhabdomyolysis lead to renal shutdown. So anuria can occur because of the renal failure, and hematuria is maybe there but not usually present, is a true statement. And how do you recognize rhabdomyolysis? there is a triad of clinical features. Myalgias, generalized weakness and darkened urine is the way that you will be identifying, and generally it is the calf muscles in the lower leg are the ones where you find the presence of tenderness. Now let us talk about lymphangiomas. They are found in fact in all these locations: axilla, head and neck, chest wall, GIT, lungs, etc. is what need to be remembered. Now there is a classification for the lymphangioma. Basically lymphangioma is a hematomatous congenital malformation of the lymphatic system in the skin and the subcutaneous tissue. So there can be a superficial vesicles, this kind of appearance called lymphangioma circumscriptum, what you are seeing here. There can be a cavernous lymphangioma and cystic hygroma. Then it is the head and neck which is the common location. It can also occur in the axilla and groin, and this is how in the axillary area you can see a large unilateral verrucous lymphangioma. And once more, cavernous lymphangioma also, head and neck is a very common location, and this is how the lymphangiomatous proliferations can occur, hematomatous growths in the back. Now the question comes, are they seen in the lung? There is an entity called pulmonary lymphangiomatosis. This shows a diffuse pulmonary lymphangiomatosis with bilateral chylous effusions, and you can see the presence of those lymphangitic dilatation as one of the rare presentations of chylous effusion differential diagnosis. In the lung they can very much happen. And there is a MRI where there is a congenital pulmonary lymphangiectasis can occur very much, and even in the chest wall also there can be development of a lymphangioma is what need to be remembered. Now what decides the wound healing? The age decides, even sex has an influence, nutrition, mechanical stress, how much of stretching is there, and obesity, smoking, shock, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, all of them have an influence very much. Berylliosis, sarcoidosis, asbestosis, they all lead to the formation of the granuloma is very much a true statement. In cholera we see darting motility. Where else do we see? We also see it in the case of the Campylobacter. And how do you describe that organism, doctor? It has got a gull-winged appearance, Campylobacter, helical shaped cell fundamentally. One more question on Campylobacter. What is the specific media that we use for the growth of the Campylobacter? We use the Campis BAP medium, and Skirros medium is another one which we very much use for the Campylobacter. Then within the Clostridium species, which are terminal, subterminal, central, endospores, morphology is a favorite question of the examiner. So Clostridium tetani has got terminal endospores, Bacillus cereus and Bacillus subtilis. If you take they have cereus has got central and subtilis has got a subterminal pore. Then perfringens of the Clostridium has got a rectangular shaped spore classically. Tetani has got terminal spore, botulinum has got subterminal spore, and difficile also has got a subterminal spore very much. So this is all the story about them. And one more organism, sporogenes, it also has got a oval, central or subterminal, any of them can be there. So finally what is your answer? You have got botulinum, tertium, sporogenes, novae, all of them have got subterminal, but tetani has got a central endospore is what you have to be very sure about. Then what are microbial adhesins? Most of the microbial adhesins are lectins. In addition, the fimbriae, pili also have got a role in enabling the organism to adhere to the epithelium. Then few questions can come on what is the structure of these adhesins. If you take Bordetella pertussis, it is the filamentous hemagglutinin which is very important. In the Helicobacter pylori, there is what is called as a BABA protein, BABA protein, blood group antigen binding adhesin it is called as, it is very important. If you take the influenza virus, hemagglutinin is a very important component for the adhesion to happen. Then for the malarial parasite, it is the Duffy blood group antigen glycoprotein which is very important for the adhesion. So these are all the various adhesins in the various organisms which is important. Then what is sandfly? Sandfly is the one responsible for the leishmaniasis and sandfly fever to be transmitted, whereas for the trypanosoma it is the CC fly, as all of you know. Now this is a good question. Plague, what is the chemotherapy treatment of choice and what is chemoprophylaxis? There is a difference between the two. Streptomycin is the drug of choice to treat the plague. Chloramphenicol is specifically important if there is a meningeal plague. And for the prophylaxis we use doxycycline and trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole as the two important drugs of choice in the management of the plague. Relapsing fever is caused by the recurrentis of the Bordetella, whereas the Burgdorferi is the one which is responsible for the Lyme disease to become spread, is what you need to basically remember. Once more, the louse-borne recurrent fever and what is the other one? Flea-borne. The differences between the two, which is more virulent, which is what is a specific organism, these are all the issues in the exam. Now if the domestic rat bites, what do you want to do? Pray Lord Ganesha. So do you need to give anti-rabies vaccine? In which subset of population do you have rat bites, doctor? Anytime you had an experience? A old farmer with a diabetes, with a peripheral neuropathy, unable to perceive if anything is biting, comes with a rat bitten feet. At least the only case I have seen, at least we have reviewed literature and created that story on that old farmer. So finally that peripheral neuropathy is responsible, why he will not perceive when the rat is biting. Now within rats also you have wild rats, and few people grow rats in the home also. They grow cat, rat, dog, everything is a part of our agrarian community, right? So if the tetanus, already he is not immunized, give the tetanus immunization. And if it is a wild rat, risk of rabies is there. But you have to prove that it is a pet rat. How do you prove? Whistle. If it comes, it is pet. If it is not, it won't. So these are all practically how do you do is a question, right? So rabies is required if it is wild, not for the domestic rat basically. So it being domestic, no role of rabies, and cleaning with antiseptic solution is accepted by anybody. Who can dare to say that it is not required? So option C and D become the true answers here. Then what are photochromogens, cotochromogens, non-chromogens? You must be very sure about the family of brothers, sisters, grandchildren of Mycobacterium. Who is managing which part of the company? So we need to remember, doctor, that we have got two important species, Merinum and Canisiae, which are basically called the photochromogens, and Scrophulaceum is the solo scotochromogen, is what you need to fundamentally remember. Similarly, you must also be sure about the algorithm. How do you differentiate one Mycobacterium from the other is also a favorite topic of the examiner. Aryl sulfatase test, niacin sensitivity, etc., etc. The nitty gritty part of microbiology, which we love to forget after getting the seat. Now mycetoma of the foot, as the name itself is, most common site is foot, not the hand. Then it is chronic subcutaneous granulomatous inflammation is very much a true statement, and bone involvement is only a late process and a rare happening, but it is only a late process is what I like to underscore. Now what is the difference between VDRL, like non-specific treponemal test versus specific treponemal test? The rapid plasma reagent test, VDRL, and ART, they are all basically called the non-treponemal reagenic tests, which are non-specific, which will take 4 to 8 weeks for them to develop. And if you treat the syphilis, what will happen to the VDRL and all these non-treponemal tests? They become negative. Whereas the specific treponemal tests, after the treatment and the cure, they still remain positive. So for the follow-up of the patient, what is important? Non-treponemal. For the diagnosis, what is specific? Treponemal specific tests are important. So that is the difference between the two. Then you have got acute bacterial infections, viral infections, HIV, SLE, aging, hypergamma-globulonemic states, all of them are the liver disorders, cirrhosis of liver, everything can lead to a false positive test. That is the unfortunate thing about the non-specific treponemal tests, which include VDRL and RPR. Whereas you have treponemal pallidum immobilization, TPI, FTA, ABS, MHA, TP, they are all called treponema specific tests. They have got very few false positive tests. The only reason why they become false positive is, instead of syphilis, if yaws, pinta, leptospira, rat bite fever, relapsing fever or Lyme disease, such things are there, then only they become false positive. They won't become false positive for every Tom and Harry reason, which include liver disease, TB, HIV, they are all false positive. For the VDRL, like non-specific tests, is what you need to basically understand. Now let us go to the next question. What is the meaning of HLA association? If HLA B27 is there, means every back pain is not because of ankylosing spondylitis. We must be very sure. It only increases the incidence, but it is not specific to say that because B27 is there, your back pain is due to this particular disease. So the ones who have HLA positivity have a more proclivity to the autoimmune disorders. Conditions like celiac disease, type 1 diabetes will show proclivity. And also the first degree relatives also have got a higher chances. Then it can be useful in diagnosis, and if HLA is positive, that means there is a genetic implication for that specific condition. So these are few issues about the HLA. Now let us talk about what are the various CD markers of lymphocyte. This is our agreement before going to exam, that one question will come on the various CD markers. So NK cells have got CD26, helper T cells have got CD4, cytotoxic have got CD8 and etc. etc. Then stem cells have CD34 plus and 31, and granulocytes have CD15 etc. Finally the question comes, how do you differentiate activated T lymphocyte from a not yet activated T lymphocyte? It is the CD3, CD25, CD45. These three CD markers are the ones which you specifically see on the activated T lymphocyte, is what you need to remember, is what I like to conclude to all of you. Now let us talk about super antigens. With a due apology to all of you, I am not a microbiologist, a humble physician, but forced to teach about molecular level immunology to all of you. Once this topic of micro is over, I think we will once more get a brighter and a faster review. Okay. Now what is a super antigen? Super antigen is one of our classmates who will read Harrison, Nelson, all the books. Finally entrance mein he will get 1,000 rank. That means the immune response created by him is very high, but a useful immunity out of it is very less. So that is the difference. Super antigens, if a normal antigen stimulates the T cells 0.01 to 0.01% of the body T cells wake up from the sleep if normal antigen is there. A super antigen will wake up 20% of the body's T cells. Then after waking up, T cells will say, whom shall we fire? Super antigen will say, I am very small, I just woke you up, that's all. Then it will fire our own tissues and we get autoimmunity. So there is a reason super antigens are implicated as a component responsible for the ignition of the immune system to elicit an autoimmune response, is what need to be remembered. Who produces the super antigens? The bacteria like Staph aureus. Streptococcus pyogenes, even toxic shock syndrome, toxin also is an example of a superantigen. Then how will superantigen why will it cause so many T lymphocytes to get activated? What is the secret in that? The MSC class 2 HLA-DQ has got a tendency to recognize this superantigen. Then in turn superantigen also can bind with there is a T cell binding region. So the T cell on one limb it will hold, with another limb it will hold MHC DQ, and that is how the T cell is directed towards the tissues. So it acts like a mediator to elicit this T cell activation process. So that is the reason we need to basically remember. So MSC and TCR induction and signaling pathway is the one which is cross-linked by the superantigen, and what are all the conditions where superantigen is the underlying culprit playing the spoil sport? It is the toxic shock syndrome, Kawasaki disease, eczema, guttate psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, scarlet fever, etc. Is what need to be basically remembered. So finally, what did the examiner specifically ask us at the end of all this story? It presents to MSC class 2 true statement, it stimulates the T cells is also a true statement, it has nothing to do with the antibody production by the B cells. These are all the things about the superantigen. Now the next thing is clonal selection theory. What does it say? Naturally all our immune system should recognize that this fellow is my own body and this is not, this is a bacteria fellow. How will it recognize? There is some training which is being given. If the training is not well given, it will more autoimmune disorders will occur. So clonal selection theory rests on 5 important hypotheses, 4 important. Each lymphocyte has got a single type of receptor with a unique specificity, and that receptor need to be occupied for the cell to get activated, and all these things. So finally clonal selection is the one which will tell that how the lymphocytes which bear a specific receptor can recognize the self molecules and the foreign molecules they can discriminate, and those who express the self molecule receptors will be eliminated so that autoimmunity is prevented. That is all the story about clonal selection theory. Now we come to the faster part of our discussion. Antiretrovirals, which are microsomal inducers and inhibitors, we must be sure. What is the antiretroviral classification? NRTs, NNRTIs and PIs. Out of these, it is the protease inhibitors which are notorious and known for their P450 microsomal inhibition is what need to be basically remembered. Whereas the NNRTs, nevirapine and efavirenz, they are the inducers of the hepatic cytochrome P450 system. So if you give rifampicin on one side and efavirenz on other side, they can have a drug interaction with each other. Then out of the protease inhibitors, it is the ritonavir, which is the most potent P450 inhibitor, is what you need to basically remember. Now let us go to the next question. Anti-cancer drugs, out of them, which of them are basically antibiotics in nature? All these anti-cancer antibiotics are produced by the Streptomyces species. They include anthracyclines like doxorubicin, dactinomycin, then plicamycin, which is mitramycin, mitomycin, bleomycin, which is a very cell cycle specific anti-cancer antibiotic that arrests the division at the level of the G2 is what need to be remembered. Some anticonvulsants are also known to be used for psychiatric indications. Which out of them? It is the valproate and lamotrigine which are used as the mood stabilizing agents is what need to be basically remembered. Now what decides the absorption of a drug in the gut? The more lipid soluble and less polar the drug, it is better absorbed from the gut. The weak acids are better absorbed from the stomach and weak bases are better absorbed from the intestine, and it is the proximal duodenum where most of the drug absorption occur is what need to be remembered. And which drugs? First pass metabolism is responsible for their breakdown before they show therapeutic efficacy. Beta blockers, especially propranolol, nitroglycerin, chloropromazine, lidocaine, aspirin, pentagocine, morphine, meperidine, they all are the drugs specifically affected by this first pass metabolism is what need to be basically remembered. Now what do you mean by KD value of a given drug? Any drug, how does it show influence? It has to go and occupy a receptor on the cell on which it shows its influence. So the number of receptors which are occupied by this given drug will have a influence on the efficacy of the drug. So KD is that value, otherwise the concentration of the drug, where 50% of the drug receptors have been occupied is called as KD. So naturally the same rule applies now. KD also is the concentration of the drug where 50% of the maximal efficacy of the drug is shown. But what is the pitfall of this theory? Every drug which comes to the reading room does not read. So every drug that occupies receptor need not have a effect of stimulating that cell. Accordingly, drugs are divided into agonists, antagonists, partial agonists, etc. So this theory of KD, using the KD where receptors 50% occupied means 50% efficacy is there, and that drug concentration is called KD. The main fallacy of that concept is if the drug is a pure agonist, then KD comes into a good meaning, it's a meaningful parameter. But if the drug is a partial agonist or an antagonist, KD has no relevance as a pharmacokinetic parameter is what you need to basically remember. Elderly individual with hypertension, what are the drug choices which are available? The JNC7 is the regulatory body which periodically gives the Joint National Committee sitting in US. Of course JNC 8 also come now, did 10 come JNC? What is the most recent JNC going on? So it says that the BP should be maintained 140 by 90. If already diabetes and chronic kidney disease is there, it need to be maintained less than 130 by 80 in the elderly population is the recommendation given by the JNC, target value. So the thiazides, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, calcium channel blockers, all of them are very much used in the case of the elderly individuals is what you need to basically remember. But the only thing is if you are using thiazides, they may go into orthostatic hypotension, and you must know what are all the adverse effect profile. Now can you use beta blockers in CHF, in congestive heart failure? Beta blockers are negatively inotropic generally, so they may worsen CHF, but lot of studies have proven that giving beta blockers in CHF will increase the long term survival of the patients. Then which beta blockers have that great importance? So the recommendation of beta blocker initiation in CHF is continue with ACE inhibitor, diuretic, digoxin, which are the part of the CHF therapy. In addition to that, you can give carvedilol 3.125 mg twice daily BD, bisoprolol 1.25 mg OD, or metoprolol 25 mg OD, any of them. These three are considered the beta blockers of choice in case of the congestive heart failure. But there are certain contraindications to use beta blockers in CHF, which we also need to know. If there is an unstable heart failure, he gets pulmonary edema just if he lies down, don't use beta blocker. Then similarly asthma or a heart rate less than 60 or a systolic BP less than 100, or if there is a heart block or a peripheral vascular disease, they only are the relative contraindications for using the beta blockers in the case of the CHF is what you need to basically remember. So it is the mild to moderate CHF under NIHA classification, class 2 and class 3 you can use beta blocker. Class 1 it is not required, class 4 it is contraindicated. So that is our convention about using the beta blockers. And beta blocker therapy in CHF must be more or less like a teenage romance. Ideally it should be start low, go slow should be the rule. Then beta blocker toxicity, how do you basically treat it? We need to give crystalloid solution immediately to restore the blood pressure. You can use inotropes, chronotropes, epinephrine, atropine for the management of bradycardia and hypotension. Glucagon has a direct antagonizing effect. We can very much use it. Then some of the beta blockers are hemodialysable, especially acebutolol, atenolol are dialysable, whereas propranolol, metoprolol and timolol are not hemodialysable is what you need to basically remember. So we use glucagon, isoproterenol, atropine, all the three are very much used in the management of the beta blocker. Toxicity is what need to be remembered. Then which are intranuclear receptors basically? We have got the glucocorticoid, mineralocorticoid, progesterone, estrogen, retinoid and vitamin D and thyroid family, which are all basically called intranuclear receptor mediated hormones. Then where do you see Juret's hemorrhage? Once there is a uncal herniation, the midbrain will suffer hypoxemic injury and that lead to hemorrhages in the ventral and paramedian parts of the upper brainstem, which are called the Juret's hemorrhage, which carry a very bad prognosis, is what need to be remembered. Then suppositous child, favorite question of the AIIMS question bank. The woman may pretend pregnancy and deliver and later produce a living child, and it is mainly to claim the property, etc., etc. Now the weight of lungs, what are the various tests which are available? We have a static test or Fodor's test where the average weight of both lungs before respiration varies. Around 30 to 40 grams and after respiration 60 to 66 grams. Then you have a hydrostatics test where the specific gravity of the lungs before respiration and after respiration are compared. Then you have a Plockwet's test where the weight of the lungs to the body ratio is being taken. It is if there was no respiration, it will be 1:70. If there is respiration, it is 1:35. Then the Redin's test is about the air in the middle ear in a live child. That means if he is live before death. Then Breslau's sign is for the air in the stomach and the duodenum. They are all the signs to prove that there is a live birth is what need to be remembered. This is another standard question which we discussed, routinely asked in the any previous question bank. The black powder which contains potassium nitrate, sulfate and charcoal, we call FG, FFG and FFFG, like blue label, green label, gold label among the Johnny Walker. So more number of F's means the finer are the grains and in the gunpowder. So that is the idea. Then gastric lavage, kerosene ingestion, hydrocarbon ingestion, is it a contraindication for gastric lavage? There is a controversy around it. Ideally not, but we generally don't give lavage in our practice. So it is not a contraindication in true sense. So, but still for this question we will consider kerosene poisoning as a important contraindication, which is generally contraindicated in corrosive poisonings except in carbolic acid. Gastric lavage is contraindicated. I leave a small literature with you for you to review about what studies say it is contraindicated, what studies say it is not contraindicated, etc., etc. Now some of the orbital tumors will clinically present like proptosis and they can cause the displacement either in inferior, superior, lateral or medial direction. So we must be very sure about it. In fact all the four, glioma, meningioma, lymphoma, schwannoma, any one of them can lead to development of proptosis. But in some of these it is a mild proptosis and it presents as a late finding. In some of these tumors it is a early finding and a severe proptosis. Only by the degree and onset they differ, but otherwise all these four tumors are known to lead to development of proptosis. Did you get this table in your literature given? It has come? Okay. There is no clarity of that. Okay, we will get it well typed and provide it to you. Now the ocular trauma, almost 2 pages of your ophthalmology textbook you will have changes in cornea, changes in retina, everything. I suddenly once more got a feeling of preparing for ophthalmology university exam preparation. What are all the side headings you need to remember in order to get a distinction score, right? So cornea, there can be aberrations and opacity, rupture of Descemet's membrane can happen, sclera can undergo rupture, and there can be iridodialysis which can occur, subluxation of lens can occur, and there can be a commotio retinae, all these are very much seen. Then what are the types of corneal dystrophy? Is it the same question in the exam, or is there any modification of this question? Otherwise lattice, macular, Fuchs, granular, everything is very much, just you need to take A, B, C, D, E, F, my hall ticket number, then you will get the seat. If something in the middle, some new thing is introduced, then we need to surprise about the, is it the same pattern maintained in exam, that all possible true statements, right? Okay. So you have got, at least for the sake of passing the evening, we need to remember, some are called superficial, some are called deep corneal dystrophies. Cogan's microscopic dystrophy, microcystic dystrophy is superficial. Then you have the granular, macular, lattice, which are the stromal corneal dystrophies. You have a deep corneal dystrophies which include cornea guttata, and the Fuchs dystrophy is what I like to underscore. Then the next question is, which are primary glaucomas, which are secondary glaucomas? Once more another classification question. So anyway, anybody will say that steroid cannot be a primary glaucoma. You must know the meaning of primary or idiopathic. So the primary glaucomas include buphtalmos, infantile glaucoma, etc. Primary open angle glaucoma, primary angle closure glaucoma. Then pigmentary glaucoma is not a primary glaucoma, rather it is a secondary glaucoma where the pigment will go and sequester in the trabecular mesh, and that lead to development of the glaucoma is what need to be remembered. This is another traditional question. Exudative, tractional, rhegmatogenous retinal detachment, what are the underlying causes? You must be 200% sure in the tomorrow's exam. So rhegmatogenous means there is a tear or break in retina. Exudative means inflammation, injury, vascular anomaly is there. And tractional is there is a fibrovascular tissue, neovascularization, that is all the story responsible. Now quickly tell me, exudative retinal detachment, what are the causes, doctor? You have central serous retinopathy, syphilis, Wand-Koyanagi-Harada syndrome, neoplastic causes like melanoma, etc., and vascular causes like hypertension, chronic renal failure, and eclampsia. Whereas rhegmatogenous retinal detachment, the most important cause is the retinal tear formation is the underlying predisposing factor. Then for the tractional retinal detachment is a proliferative diabetic retinopathy which is responsible for the tractional retinal detachment. Even retinopathy of prematurity is an example of a tractional retinal detachment, and also ocular trauma can lead to it. But what is the point you need to remember here? Diabetes and proliferative retinopathy is tractional, whereas hypertension and eclampsia are basically responsible for exudative retinal detachment. So there should not be a confusion between the two, if at all we want to confuse. Only if you know the individual causes for each we will confuse. But you at least most common cause, one question invariably comes. Then trachoma leads to what? So we need to know that trachomatous ptosis is there, trichiasis, entropion, not ectropion. There can be symblepharon, drying of the eye with the xerosis, pannus formation, corneal scar, etc., etc. So the entropion, dry eye, and corneal opacity are the true statements about the trachoma and its complications. Now what are all the drugs which are used in acute congestive glaucoma? So you must know the entire list of it. At least I am sure that you won't answer a mydriatic as an answer. Mydriatics will worsen. So we don't give atropine which can worsen a glaucoma, and we don't, we tend to give the pilocarpine 1% drops for acute congestive glaucoma, and timolol and hyperosmotic agents like glycerol, mannitol, urea, isosorbide are very much used, and we give analgesics also, and once it is a established absolute stage of glaucoma, no more medical management, it becomes a surgical management.